Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. It's raining men tonight. We are celebrating dads, and happy Father's Day to everyone. We want to stress the importance of having that male energy involved with kids and their reading journeys. So each man we have here today has had their own reading struggles as children. And they all have children where they were really careful about looking for different signs. And we're going to hear from them about what they did to advocate for their own children. So I'll start introducing people in no particular order. I'll start with Tre Hadrick. Tre is a school counselor in a career and technical high school in Pennsylvania. He is an educator, author, and he is also with the Pennsylvania State Education on the Board of Education. So welcome, Tre. I tutored his son, Ernesto, and we still have a relationship now. So it's great to have you.
Thank you.
Then we have John Mullarkey. And I hope I'm saying that right, John. Did I say it correctly? Yes? Okay. And John, Judy and I met at our 1-year party, our anniversary party. And we met through his wife, Mandy, who has been a follower of my page, High Five Literacy, and is a big fan of the Literacy View. So we welcome John here. John, I believe you're a researcher. Is that correct?
I'm a financial advisor.
A financial
but I'm also
advisor.
the board treasurer for the Illinois chapter of the Reading League.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to have you. Then we have Danny Marino. And no, not the football player, Dan Marino, but certainly a superstar dad. I know Dan for years, and I worked with all 3 of his children who are now adults. And Danny was a fireman, so certainly a hero in more ways than one, a great dad, a hero to so many. And we're so happy to have Danny with us today. We have Jason Orlosky, and Jason is a parent who is working with Judy now, and she tutors Jason's son and is continuing to work with him. And Jason is an advocate and is very vocal about getting his son's needs met. Jason, I don't know what you do outside of this. Sorry.
But that's fine. That's fine. I'm in the world of finance too, similar to John.
Oh, all right. Couple of finance guys here. And then last but not least, we have Stephen Yearout. And Stephen has a podcast called Empower Dyslexia. I would highly recommend people listen. Stephen, I think you're in IT, or you were in IT. Is that correct, Stephen?
That's correct.
And he is a really strong advocate for all families and children with dyslexia. And he speaks about it weekly on his podcast. And I'm a big fan of Stephen. So it's great to have you here. So excited.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here with all these other fine young men. Get ready to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is making sure that we have the fathers involved when we're dealing with our children with special education, special needs. When we have that mother and the father there as a united front, man, the ARD meetings and the 504 meetings, they go completely different. So I'm excited to see other men here that are out there standing up for our children. When I say our children, said this before, it's a collective, our children. because all of these kids are our kids, and we are all out of here fighting for our children to make sure that they can be the best versions of themselves that they can be.
100%. And I love what you said about showing up at IEP meetings. That is 100% right. I've had this conversation with mothers and fathers. I'm sure some people here have heard me say, show up. And I hate to say it, but there is just a different energy at the table when the dads are there. So definitely
100%.
They should be showing up to those IEP meetings. So thank you. So we're going to just start this conversation going. So first question, we want to know about you. Before we talk about your kids, we want to know about how you kind of knew, the first sign you knew that maybe you were having some difficulties with reading, writing, and the emotional component as far as growing up with these feelings. So doesn't matter to me who starts, but who would like to open it up? Anyone? Well,
I'll go. It's okay.
All right.
I just want to say hello to everybody. Nice to meet everybody. I just want to backtrack. My dad, he was also a New York City firefighter. He worked 2 jobs. He didn't come from an educated family. He was self-educated. My mom, too, I think had problems with her education too. She had 2 brothers who were brilliant. Obviously, it didn't go to her, and it didn't go to me. So really, the first time I think I realized that
I'm going to just interrupt you, Dan, because when you say it didn't go to you or whatever about being brilliant, you are extremely smart. I just want to say that just because you might have had struggles in school doesn't mean you're not a bright person. So I just had to interrupt you.
And I agree with that. Probably the first time I realized was I'm going to say 2nd or 3rd grade. We were reading paragraphs out loud, and the teacher stopped me. She goes, "Dan, what are you reading? Like, you're not saying the words that are written down." And I said, wow, I couldn't identify, like, if the word see the cat run, I was like, the clouds are light today. And I couldn't. She says, I think you need glasses. I'm going to call your parents. And that's how it all started. And back then, I don't think there was ways to determine I had a learning disability. I don't think there was any test. So then my parents got involved. They really didn't get involved in my education because they were busy working. And that's how was school today, Dan? Great. Did you do your homework? Great. And that was basically it. So that was the beginning of the struggles. That's what I remember in the beginning.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's that moment, right, where there's something that happens that triggers a thought. Who would like to go next?
I mean, mine was somewhat similar. Mine was I remember it was in
I'll
kindergarten.
Okay. Yep. Go ahead, Jason.
Thanks, Trey. Sorry about that. For me, it was I was fortunate. My parents were actually great at school, both in the top of their class, and no slouch, but at the same time, something was a little bit off. And actually going through kindergarten, was having struggles. There was one part I was great in, math and all those sort of things, but the other side of the learning just wasn't there. And I was lucky. My parents were advocates for me, so they went to the school, and the school said, "Look, he's testing fine. He's sort of low average, but he's okay on the reading and the sort of comprehensive side of things, whatever reading took place in kindergarten back then. So everything's fine." And they said, "No, we're not really accepting that." And they actually went to a number of specialists. I think it took us about a year to figure it all out, and eventually realized that I'm dyslexic, and took me to a specialist for it. But they, the mantra from the school, and it's something I picked up with my kids, was well, it's fine. He's exceptional in one area, but everything else, he just has to catch up. It just has to catch up. There's no other issue that's going on. And I've sort of taken that to heart ever since, especially that early on, you shouldn't have that much of a difference. And then I'm lucky my parents spotted that early on. I didn't have to go through the middle or late part of elementary school to realize there was really a problem.
Yeah, that's unusual that your parents were able to be on that so early. And you're very fortunate. Tre, why don't you tell us a bit about your story?
Sure. So for me, I'm a child of two educators. My parents, my mother in particular, was a English and a math teacher. I was considered gifted as a kid. So a little bit more hands-on than the average. Think outside the box. But I realized when I was nervous to read out loud in class, I knew there was an issue going on. I realized that when I would be able to converse and say certain words, but if it was on the page, I couldn't pick the word off the page, and then I would read it and someone helped me. And I'm like, wow, I know what that word means when I'm conversing with someone, but I didn't know how to read it off the page, right? And sometimes it still struggles with that, truth be told. So it's definitely, well, elementary, middle school, the times where the teacher would say, who's next? And you put your head down or you act like you're sleeping and stuff like that, to avoid having to read aloud. And, for me, that was when I realized that reading was a challenge for me. And I tried my best to memorize a lot of things, especially when discussions were going on in class, so that no one would know that I didn't know what was happening. If I struggled to read or if I didn't read, and that was for me, my situation.
So a couple of people with that read aloud part, the embarrassment is something that lasts. John, what about you?
Sure. So, family of immigrants. My dad's parents, my grandparents, immigrated in the 1920s from Ireland, and my mom immigrated in 1956 from Ireland. So, all the grandparents were various agricultural, or one was a bartender. So that's what our family did. I was one of the delays came later. I was one of those really obnoxious kids that, at 2 or 3 years old, you'd throw a book at me and I would start reading it. And it just came very natural to me. I don't recall, and with as much as I've learned now about science of reading and structural literacy and how explicit instruction is, I don't recall being explicitly instructed on phonemic awareness, on anything that we know as part of how kids learn to read. My struggles came later. It was, I was constantly a student in elementary school and everything, but there was always that needs improvement in finishes tasks on time, finishes homework, finishes this, finishes that. And once we got into being more independent in middle school, in particular in high school, it came to the point where I struggled greatly with being able to stay focused, stay on task, be able to complete assignments, even though it was well within my capacity to do them. And, we now know that as ADHD paralysis, but, in the early mid 80s, we knew that as do your work, kid. And then so that's really where my education struggled, despite where I was able to do very well in many things. It was very difficult for me to stay on task, for me to complete tasks, something I struggle with to this day. And that's been where I have not been able to, at times, complete everything that I would want to, and to have some of the completion in life that I would want to have. It took me 7 years to earn my bachelor's. It took me a variety of different longer terms where it was well within my capacity, but just could not get past that paralysis.
So for
that's
you,
where I got stuck.
part of it was the attentional piece. Interesting. And Stephen, can't wait to hear from you.
So my story is a little different. I was born here in America. We moved to Australia when I was 6 months old, and I grew up from 6 months to 8 years old. So kindergarten through third grade in Australia. It wasn't until we moved back here to the States, so that's third grade year, that we had to do a bunch of testing to see where I was at from the curriculum in Australia versus the curriculum here. They were seeing where they were going to place me. My sister went up a grade. I got held back. Now, there were some struggles in Australia. I do remember, struggling in second and third grade there. However, when I got back here to the States, it was just wheels off. I got held back that time, and then I got held back another time the next year going. I was paddled every day in third grade for not turning in homework. When they figured out that paddling wouldn't work, they made me start writing sentences, which basically turns into paragraphs. And at one point in time, they removed me from class and stuck me in the cafeteria by myself. And I sat in there and wrote sentences all day long. And they're like, "You're not coming out until you finish." I was a star athlete. And I jokingly say this, I was a star athlete for the first 6 weeks every year because we had no pass, no play. I beat myself up because I knew I was letting not only myself down, I was letting my teammates down, I was letting my coaches down. The real struggle you start seeing is, that, and I know this sounds conceited, but that you're probably one of the smartest people in the room. However, you can't perform like your other classmates. And I remember that struggle. And I was the kid that everybody liked, right? All my teachers loved me. The principals loved me. Coaches loved me. Very popular. But I knew that it was all a lie. And I tell everybody, when I go speak, I tell people, you can't lie to yourself. You can lie to everybody else, but you can't lie to yourself. When you lay your head down at night, you know that you can't read. You know that you can't. And while that may sound very insignificant to a lot of people, but you go through life today and try not to read the entire day, just one day. And you almost can't do it.
It sounds like imposter syndrome,
well,
right?
Yeah,
You're living this lie.
If you go talk to just about any dyslexic that's out there, especially an adult, that's the piece that they talk about. They hide this their entire life. They hide it from their job because you don't want your coworkers to know that you can't read, or you can't read fast enough to really keep up with the amount of work that you need to do. You hide it from your classmates, and your or you can't really hide it from your teachers. Your teachers know. But what that ends up doing is that puts a tidal wave of depression, anxiety, self-hate coming right behind you, because it's going to get you, because at one point in time, it's going to be too much. You're going to hit that wall, whether it's third grade or whether it's seventh grade, whatever. You're going to hit that wall where your compensation skills can't work anymore. You can't listen enough. You can't guess enough. You can't watch enough YouTube videos, whatever, to try to get by. You have to be able to read.
So, Judy, we just heard from 5 dads, all different stories, but it's the same idea. What kinds of questions do you have for our dads?
So the first thing that I want to say is I have a comment. That was hard. It was hard to hear how much pain many of you have been through. And it was just really hard. And I know that I work in some schools where there's a lot of struggling students, and it immediately makes me think, how those students might be feeling, especially right now. It's end of year benchmarks are happening in a lot of schools, and uh, universal screeners are a great thing, but I could only imagine what it feels like for a kid that's still struggling to see, a page of text, which can be very overwhelming and stressful, even for kids that are breaking the code. But I could only imagine how that feels for kids that have not. And, I think that what the men said really resonates with me, because I think that, a lot of the struggling students that I've interacted with, they're very bright. They're extremely bright. They're extremely aware. They very often know that something is difficult for them. But I think it's also important to support those students, but also capitalize on their strengths, because some of those students are the ones that are going to have the richest discussions in your classroom. And I think it's so important to make those students, learn how to read and read well, but also, focus on a lot of the strengths that many of those students do have, because so many of them are so bright and so articulate. But
So
I
let's
do want to say
actually,
something. Let me just
I
say
just
one more
want
thing. Let me just say one more thing.
yeah.
But like the pain that many of you spoke about, where, you had to just read out loud at any time, that was known as round robin reading. And I grew up with that as well. I do want to give you guys some good news. I'm seeing a hell of a lot less of that in classrooms right now. I could only imagine how painful it must have been for you guys as kids, waiting for it to be your turn and possibly not being able to read the words on the page. So round robin is out of style, right, Faith?
So hopefully it's not being used the way it used to be used. But you said something about strengths. I'd like to know, each one of you, what did you do for yourself as an outlet? What was it that was your escape, where there was something hopefully that made you feel really good? I'd like to know that, because I think families need to know that that's such an important component to find the strength. So
So
I don't
can I start? So, and I know this probably isn't going to be the most popular um, opinion. While yes, I look at it as we got to look, we got to know our audience, right? Whenever you're talking about working towards your strengths, not necessarily your deficits. I talk about it a little differently. I talk about it as what we need to do is we need to get your deficits that you have up to the level of your strengths, and then you can truly be this superhuman. Because what we dyslexics end up doing, if you really just peel back the onion all the way, is we're learning survival compensation skills in order to deal with being put into a classroom or an environment that we physically, at that point in time, physically cannot do what we're being asked to do. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes a lot of sense. And I think when we talk about strengths, certainly as someone who teaches all kids to read and write, the way I do it is I have to know the deficit, the skill deficit areas. But I do think it is important for that emotional health, the mental health, to have something, an outlet. Maybe I didn't say it the right way. And
No,
thank you for,
you
putting a
did
different
say it.
spin.
Sorry, you did say it the right way, and I understand that concept of because you have to deal with the mental health issues before you ever start really working on the remediation piece, because it will never really work, because you're constantly dealing with the mental health piece, the depression, the anxiety, the self self-worth piece of it. I completely agree with that. So now, as far as strengths go, I mean, I was an athlete, taught martial arts, did martial arts from 8 years old on. And again, it's the disability is a small sliver in life, but just because it's a disability does not mean you have an inability to do life itself. It's one small area that we have to deal with, and we have to make sure that we're making sure that those kids can read and write like non-dyslexics.
Yeah. Danny, what about you? You're muted, Dan. Just, yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, I don't know why. Sports played a big part in my life. And the one thing I realized that there were guys and whoever did play sports who were very smart. So I felt like I was there with them, and I interacted with them, and and it took me away from reality. I used to bicycle. I grew up in Queens and Bayside. We bicycle ride everywhere. So it's I might be a little older than you guys. I'm 65 years old. So I'm not sure if you're in the same category as me. I don't know if we always talk, my friends always talked about, did we suffer from depression and anxiety, or did we not know it? And did we just have coping mechanisms to deal with it without going to a therapist, which was unheard of back then? It was just, we did everything outside until it was dinner time. And that's how I escaped everything. And then when I came home and opened up the books, I'm like, oh man, here we go again. So that was basically my childhood.
It was my childhood too, Dan, just to tell you. Being a Brooklyn girl, that's what we did. After school, you were out playing,
exactly.
And you just knew when dinner time was coming. That was it.
That's it.
But
Absolutely.
It's interesting what Dan said about the coping mechanism, that, today we're so open about talking about mental health issues, where years ago, that was not something that we ever talked about, because I'm not much younger than you, Dan, and nobody talked about that. Tre is a counselor, and I know he's very concerned with mental health. So Tre, tell us about your outlet and give us your take on mental health and having an outlet.
So for me, it's very similar to the gentleman prior, and I think it's because the public school system, even the private school, sports is usually the first extracurricular offering. So often you're going to hear many people say sports is an outlet. Yes, that was mine. I was fortunate to be pretty successful in athletics as a kid, through high school and beyond. But that was definitely where I was using an outlet. But I also used to draw a lot. When I was in the classroom and, it was my time to read, or when I was frustrated, when there was an assignment going on, I was at home and maybe doing my homework, you would see me like doodling all over the place. So to me, that was a good outlet that allowed me to stay calm when I was frustrated. It allowed me to, get my thoughts of whatever that was at the time out on the paper, and it saved me from, boiling it all inside or bubbling up inside, with frustration and depression and different things. I was fortunate to have a great support system at home. So when I did get frustrated with assignments, my parents were supportive, but it didn't always help when they weren't there, right? So it definitely makes, as a counselor myself, when I think about students, and as we spoke earlier about depression and the mental health aspect, I always tell people, we speak often about cyberbullying and we speak about bullying, but there's nothing worse than when a kid is being made can't read, and I think that's one of the most challenging situations that kids have to deal with. So when we talk about the reading and then the mental health, I think that goes hand in hand when we're trying to help our children.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. That's the first time I'm hearing that you like to draw. I knew you were a college football star. I had no idea that drawing was an outlet for you. So that's the first for me. So that was interesting. John, what about you?
So I'll give the stereotypical echo and say, yeah, I'm a guy who played sports as a kid. So, I was a little bit further upstate New York, and went to Pine Bush High School initially, and then we moved to Connecticut when I was 16. But, for me, it was tougher just for the sake of, only child. My parents divorced when I was a baby. My grandparents, my mom's parents, had actually retired to a suburb of Dublin. And then when the divorce happened, they built a house across the street from my mom. And so a lot of times I would come home, get off the bus with grandma, and then figure out something to do with my time for the next 3 hours because mom was working a couple of hours away and wouldn't be home until 6 or 7. So there were a lot of games, though. We developed our version of baseball in the cul-de-sac where we had a wiffle ball bat that we shoved newspaper full of it. So it was a little bit heavier, and we used a tennis ball so it wouldn't break any windows. And that was our game. But a couple of things that I've also done is my grandmother really was able to invigorate a lot of cooking. And for me, with my issues with following tasks and saying on things, that's something that, look, it's a finite series of steps. You can be so creative, less creative, but it gives that satisfaction, like kind of that checklist satisfaction, you know what I mean? Of being able to complete each part of it as a whole. If you want to get a little bit more creative with it, cool. And that was a good creative outlet for me to be able to do that. But sorry, guys, slightly younger. And I was also a teenager when that whole internet gaming boom just started in the late 90s. And that was something where I mentioned that we moved to Connecticut and that was when I was 15. That was tough. That was my sophomore year of high school. Leaving behind friends, leaving behind everything. It was very difficult, but fortunately we were able to stay connected to the degree that we started gaming together and met a lot of people together. And in fact, met my wife through a gaming group, a Star Wars gaming group, where that's how we got together.
That's
To this day, with the same friend who I know since we were 4 years old, went to kindergarten together. The last thing that we did a lot together was the thing that everyone hated in the 80s. Yeah, that was Dungeons and Dragons. That was my creative outlet. And again, very task oriented, very do this, find critter, roll dice, hit things. And it was just process and completion. And so the satisfaction of being able to complete the tasks were very calming and soothing.
Yeah, that's, I'm sure, satisfying for you. Yeah. And Jason.
Yeah, I mean, I similar as well, and enjoyed a lot of extracurriculars, a lot of after-school activities, and all of those things. I think sort of one interesting, I think it was initial coping mechanism. I'm curious. I think probably everyone had a somewhat similar experience. One of the first things I did when I wasn't able to read was expanded my memory. I was able to memorize a lot. Because in the beginning, if you can't read the words, well, if you remember what it roughly looks like, and then you come into class and you read it, your memory just gets better as you do more and more of this stuff. And it's actually one of the things that Judy and I talk about all the time with my son that we struggle with. For me, math was fantastic because back in the day when I was getting math, it was just computational math. If you could do this, that, or the other, it was really simple. We had those full sheets where you'd have to fill out the multiplication tables, everything else, just brute memorization. And that honestly, the byproduct of being dyslexic, that was my superpower. I could memorize everything. It was easy. So it was, I have my outlets somewhat similar with other stuff outside of school, but I actually had something in school that I really excelled at and that I was really fantastic at. So it was, it was the reading was pure misery. I had all sorts of very similar issues to what we all talked about. But at least I had my one strong point academically that I could go through. And it took a while until the brute memorization didn't carry anymore. But at least for that period of time, I mean, that was partly my outlet. It sort of helped me get through school too, where I could say, hey, at least I can do this. When this comes up, this is easy. I know this is simple. And the rest of it was still a struggle, but at least I had that going for me.
Wow, this is so interesting. Judy, any thoughts about what you've heard or any questions you have? I'm just thinking about so many things that I'd like to ask, but go ahead.
I have a lot of thoughts on my mind. I definitely want to speak about all your kids too, eventually. But so do you guys feel that you overcame your issues? Do you still struggle? Do you feel like you're in a great place professionally? Do you feel like this impacted your life in a positive way in any way? Like, do you feel you're as successful as you could be and that you've overcome most of your challenges? Or do you feel like you're still struggling in some ways? And how did it affect you professionally? Was the world kind, the professional world? You all seem like you're in a pretty good place. I want to hear a little bit more about, how's it going?
That's a good question. So, some people, I think, feel that maybe they chose a career where they wouldn't have to use reading or writing too much and they were able to excel. Some people maybe fought their way through. So it is an interesting question. Why don't we start with Jason, since I left him for the end? So let's start with Jason.
Yeah, I think from hearing everyone's stories and from other folks as well, I was lucky. They identified it extremely early on for me. I was in a phenomenal public school system where we had this thing called pre-first. So they took all the elementary school kids and the ones that went to kindergarten and had a problem. They actually had a special program where it didn't matter what it was, but if you had a challenge, you weren't quite ready for first grade, you had that. I had my parents.
Jason, tell us where though. Jason, let me interject. Where was this?
This was in a little town just outside of Princeton, New Jersey. Unfortunately, those programs don't really exist anymore, but it was great. And the reason I say it is by the time I got to middle school, I was all caught up. I'd given enough skills, support, help, everything. I mean, it's both what the school did. I went to a learning specialist 2 to 3 times a week. My parents were unbelievably on top of it with everything from flashcards and games and all sorts of engaging pieces to really try to bridge this gap. So that by the time I got to middle school, I was actually in a great spot. I had gone from not liking school and having challenges and all of these things to basically going to honors classes there and throughout. So it really, that early intervention and not just early, but very intense, very focused intervention made a very big difference. And as I went through high school, college, career, I don't even note it career-wise. I never have because I feel like I've overcome it. And today, while I still work with a lot of numbers, I love numbers and it's great. A lot of what I do too is a tremendous amount of reading. I think I looked at it once, and it's reading like a couple hundred pages a day. And I also write professionally too. So it's gotten me to a great spot. But as I hear plenty of stories, it's because it was caught early and it was something that was just so intense and so focused that it was successful. But that as I'm understanding, that's not necessarily as common as it should be.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's really incredible because, again, I don't want to ask how old you are, but in my world, that's just unheard of in terms of years ago. That just wouldn't have been something that most parents would be able to do so early on. So that's really incredible. Stephen, what about you?
I tend to go the complete opposite direction. I don't look at dyslexia as a superpower. I don't look at it as something that is a quote unquote positive, because I can't see how not being able to read has any positive to it whatsoever. Yes, there's a lot of coping mechanisms or coping skills that we had to develop in order to just survive in life. To give you an example, I was testifying to the Senate and House Education Committee in Austin. And one of the things that I said to them was, as a man, how do you think it makes a man feel to know that they can't, or at that time, they could not provide and or can't provide for the family the way that their family deserves to be taken care of, because you can't get that type of job. I've done it all. I've done everything from carpentry to teaching martial arts, bodyguarding, head bouncer at nightclubs in the 90s, to IT. So now I'm a special education advocate. So I mean, there is a plethora of things that I've done in life. However, I can tell you right now, at 45, when I went through remediation and finally really learned how to read, was the first time in life that I ever knew and truly felt that I could at that point do anything that I ever wanted to do. And the one thing that it did was make me angry that I wasn't taught like this back in school.
I could hear
Because
it.
it would have changed my life. It would have changed my parents' life. It would have changed my sister's life. And people don't really understand that piece of it, where you're like, well, why would it change your sister's life? Well, dyslexia flows over into every aspect of a dyslexic's life. That's their family, that's their siblings, their parents, their teachers, everybody that associates and or pours life into that child. Dyslexia will affect everybody that's around them. So I tend to, again, push for, let's give them the most relevant and studied remediation, get them to be able to read and spell like non-dyslexics, and allow them to go off and flourish like they should be.
That's amazing that you first got help at 45 years old. That's really just amazing to hear.
Well, it's because you don't ever want to face the 800-pound gorilla in the room, right? You don't want to be told that, yeah, you are all those things that people say about you when you were in school. So as an adult, you tend to try to, push it down, hide it, forget about it, whatever.
Yeah.
But, like I tell people all the time, when I say the word disability, I'm not afraid of that word. I'm not afraid to use that word, because if I went to it before I was able to read and spell like a non-dyslexic, if I went to a doctor's office or I went to an interview and I had to fill out applications and or forms or whatever, guess what showed up with me? My disability. Dyslexia came right along with me. So that's the reason why my focus is always about the remediation, making sure that these kids can and will be successful in life.
Tre, what about you? Overcoming your difficulties? How do you feel about that now?
Honestly, like I said earlier, being full transparent, I think there's still some struggles. I did learn a lot when my son was going through his tutoring sessions with you. It made me almost rewire my brain at the same time. So I definitely feel that. And even recently, I had to do something at my job where I had to read some names and different things. And I was put on the spot, and it was challenging, right? One, preparation would have helped, but even some people who don't have to prepare because they can read so well that it wouldn't make a difference. I struggled, and I got through it. And it's one of those things, you look back on life and one day you'll realize why you had to go through it, right? But it doesn't feel good. And no matter what, even as an educator, there are people who are struggling with reading, right? I know I overheard a conversation a few years ago when my former leadership team in my old school were doing like a book study, and one of my coworkers, and I just happened to be in the room, but I was like, I can't read all that. That's too much. I was like, wow. And this is one of the time I was, still working with you and my son, and I knew right away what time it was. Like, you can't read. I knew it immediately. I was like, this gentleman can't read. Like, it was just, or you can't get the words off the page, whatever it was, and I just understood that. So it just makes me think that there's more people out there. I mean, we've mastered the skill of test taking and finding ways to complete those things, but mastering the skill of learning how to read and pulling the words off the paper is different, right? I think that's where, it's a struggle. And I think there's more people out here, but they stay in their comfort zone, right? For what words they can work with, if they can at all. And that allows them to appear to be successful, but not reach their full potential.
I think that's what Stephen was saying before about reaching your full potential. It holds you back in some ways. Dan?
I still struggle a little in certain areas. I think I've overcame tremendous amount. I've had some personal goals and some personal rewards. I studied for promotion on my fire department, the FDNY, and I was promoted. So I accomplished a lot. I overcame my disabilities by myself. I never went to anybody. I really didn't realize this until I graduated high school, that I needed to do something on my own and figure it out. Should I have gone to professional people? Maybe I should have. Probably too embarrassed at that time. So yes, I still struggle in one or two certain areas, but I'm so happy how far I've came. I'm very open about it to my family, to my children. And of course they do make fun of me all the time. So they're out of the will. So that's it.
I said this to you recently, Danny, when we were talking. I will never forget when I first assessed your children. And this is when I was working out of my home and I had my clients come to the house.
Yes.
And you brought all 3 kids to have them assessed. And I'll never forget afterwards looking at you, and you were just crying. I will not fit, like tears were coming out. And you said to me, this brings back all those memories, watching them, how I felt about myself. I'll never forget that conversation we had. Do you remember that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
A lot of their trials and tribulations going through grade school and schools. I remember them very clearly because it just reflected my own paths, and they were so much smarter than me. They really were. They just were smarter than me. So I knew just getting them in touch with the right people, being an advocate, me and my wife, and just working hard with them. We thought that they could do it, and then we just told them, you guys are the greatest. We love you. There's no stigma attached to this. There's a college or a job for you. You do well in life. This is not what it's all about. We live in Long Island, but we live in a small town. 300-400 kids graduate high school. Every parent thinks their kids are a genius. And I said, well, that's not true. There's so many kids like you. It's just that you're all hiding. And I wish that you could form a club and talk about your issues and just know that you're not alone in this path. And I think that's schools that I don't know if they do that anymore. If they do that now, Faith, but that's something that they should really discuss, that kids are looking for other kids who have the same issues. And there's so many of them, I'm sure, and it'd just be wonderful for them to meet once a week and say, wow, look at this. I'm okay,
I think that's a very, very interesting idea. And, I just remember you almost blaming yourself, Danny, because Danny's wife is like this really smart lawyer, judge now. She's, very high achieving. And then I remember you saying, they must have gotten this from me. And I remember you blaming yourself. And that was, that stayed with me. That really stayed with me. John, what about you?
Can I bring up one more point? I'm sorry, John. My daughter wanted to bring this out. When she was in high school, they used to pull her out of gym class to go to a resource class. And she said the embarrassment was incredible. And, you know, she said, can you just bring that up? I don't know how much influence you have with districts or teachers, but don't do that. You know, everyone knew that that kid was going to a resource class because they were, you know, deficient in something. And it was very embarrassing for them. And it really, really affected my daughter. So I just something a point, and I'm sure other kids had the same issues too. I'm sorry about that. Sorry, John.
You better believe it. That does come up all the time about
Okay.
when to pull kids out and
Right.
not to miss recess or things they enjoy. John, what about you?
Sure. So just kind of refreshing it, it's with how it affected, how it affected moving forward in life. I mean, most of this really had to be, like I say, the older I got, the more of an impact disability had. And that also got coupled with an injury that I had. I broke my L4 vertebrae when I was skiing at Vernon Valley when I was 16, which also hampered my physical ability to participate in sports and everything like that. I went through a very rough patch in my early 20s where I worked at, you know, designing kitchens at Home Depot for, I think, like $12 an hour or something like that at that point. And it was not fulfilling in any way for a kid who had gotten A's in the hard sciences, for a kid who was able to do all those things. And I spent an awful lot of time sitting and staring at myself and saying, how much of your intelligence have you wasted in doing this? And thankfully met a girl that dragged me out to Illinois, which is the only sin, but got a lot of life on track. Now, have I had a rewarding career in financial services? Yes. It's obviously we've done quite well for ourselves. Yeah, a little bit of luck, God's good grace, and everything like that along the way. And I think anybody in this industry will tell you that's the case. But had I been able to have the motivation to start sooner and start earlier, I can only imagine where I would have been at 41, even though where I am, again, blessed to be in the position that I am. But gosh, I sit at night now and think, man, what could you have done? And that's what drives me to make sure that whatever it is that my kids can do, that they will absolutely have the means by whatever advocacy, resource, and everything that I need to bring to the table, that, yeah, you're going to have that.
And that's going to be our next question.
That's going to be our next segue. Yeah. So I definitely want to hear about, you know, how this all impacted your lives as fathers and what you guys have been doing for your kids. But I also had a question that I wrote down. What do you think of the state of schools right now in this country, right now at this moment in time? Have you guys been listening to Sold a Story, and what are your thoughts? And then I had a comment. So, you know, Stephen, you mentioned the word disability and using it. And, you know, I've actually struggled a little bit with that word, but it was interesting to hear you saying that word and saying, from a personal perspective, like my own kids had their own issues growing up. And I was so sensitive about that word disability. I thought, okay, that means they're lacking an ability. That's so negative. But you speaking about it and saying it's okay to say you have a disability was really interesting for me, because I kind of always thought about it was such a negative word, and it almost made me uncomfortable. And like, even in colleges, hearing, oh, there's a disability center, you know, I heard, you know, my own kids or others' kids that I said, oh, I would never go there because it says I'm lacking ability or that there's something wrong with me. So I thought that was an interesting piece.
So that's an internal thing that we as adults have to deal with.
Right.
So Danny actually brought this up about, I really wish there was a place that the kids could get together and show that you're not alone and whatever. Well, why would dyslexics have to do that if a disability wasn't shameful? And if we could get over the shame of the word disability, you wouldn't be as hesitant to use the word disability when you look at somebody in a wheelchair because they have a disability. The reason why we tend to not look at it as a disability in learning disability is because people are like, oh, well, you're so smart. You're so this, you're so that. You've got all these other areas that you can be in, but it's still a disability. It's as much a disability as somebody in a wheelchair as somebody who has dyslexia. And if you think that it's not, I'll say this. In Texas, every middle schooler has to run at least a mile. You have to be able to complete a mile, every middle schooler. So not providing accommodations, not providing text to speech, not providing a human reader, whatever that these kids need. That would be the same thing, or saying, well, you can read it, you can use it on the text, but you can't use it on the answers. Text to speech. That's the same thing as telling a kid who is in a wheelchair, well, we'll put your wheelchair at the halfway point. If you can get there, well, then we'll give you can use your wheelchair and finish the race or finish the mile. It's just as much a disability. We can't be ashamed of it. It is what it is.
I hear you, but I think that we still have to be sensitive to like where people are at in their journey and what makes, certain students feel comfortable. I don't know. It's just definitely something to think about.
I would say don't get comfortable in the shame. I would say if we are out there teaching these kids to read and write like non-dyslexics, and we're providing that support. One of the things Tre said that I loved was he had an amazing support system around him.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the most successful dyslexics that are out there, you look at the Richard Bransons, you look at the Steve Jobs, you look at all of these people, one thing that they all had in common was an amazing support structure around them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got
I
there.
agree with 1,000%.
I mean, Jason talked about, being able to go to a school that provided that support at an early age. Look, my parents were going to send me to one of the most prestigious schools in Dallas for dyslexia. I wouldn't go. Why? Because I didn't understand that you could actually be taught to read and spell like non-dyslexics. Mm-hmm. I think if us in the advocacy arena, if we can push that, we can get your deficits up to the same level as your strengths. We can make you that superhuman and then allow you to go on and be successful. If we can push that narrative versus, well, you're good at drawing. Well, what if
excuse me, Judy, mute yourself. There's a lot of echo. Yeah.
So, I mean, I get off my soapbox, but that's something I'm very passionate about is making sure that we just make sure that the kids understand that, yes, it is a disability. However, it does not mean you have an inability to do life. We're going to provide the support, and we're going to, as Tre said, we're going to rewire your brain so that you can read and spell like a non-dyslexic. That's where the hope is. And
I just want to be clear, not everybody here was diagnosed with dyslexia. So whether there was dyslexia and it was undiagnosed because of a generational thing, or it just might not be dyslexia. There are developmental language issues, ADHD. So dyslexia is one area where kids can have these reading and writing difficulties, but not everything is dyslexia here. So I just want to be clear about that.
All right, so I want to go back to the other comment I had. State of the schools. I want to hear, unmute your mics. What do you think of the state of the schools? This is definitely a transitional time in the literacy world. Dads, tell me what you're thinking.
Realistically, I mean,
so
you mentioned Sold a Story, And that's a very important part of where I got involved in this whole thing. If you had told me 6 years ago, before my son was diagnosed with dyslexia, dysgraphia, my youngest son also has general anxiety. If you had told me that I would have been on the board of directors for a advocacy group focused on structured literacy, I wouldn't have been able to understand what 5 or 6 of those words meant if you told me that 6 years ago. And I think that, we have to keep banging the drum on this, because I represent on that board. I am the only person who's not a teacher, not in education in any way, shape, or form. I am first, foremost, and always just a parent. What my aha moment was really with the schools and learning, learning what balanced literacy was, learning who Lucy Culkins was. My aha moment really was when I learned that in our district, which is, it's Naperville 203. I mean, we need to start saying it out loud and calling people out. Naperville, it's a colleague of mine refers to it as the best marketed school district in the country, because everybody in this area wants to move to Naperville for the schools. Everybody thinks that it's the best things in sliced bread, and yet only 64% of kids are proficient in English, and this is pre-pandemic. In writing, I should say. Reading, I said 3 words, not the same thing. and by the end of 8th grade, and that's considered good. Why? My real aha moment was learning that several of the teachers who teach in my kids' school, which is community based, their own children who are my kids' contemporaries, my kids' peers, they had tutors for their own children for reading.
Bingo.
What did we miss?
That's,
and it's.
I've said this before, John. I just want to say, over the years, and I've been doing this a long time, I would say 75% of my clients, the parent or both parents, were educators. And because they knew that they weren't really going to get what they needed in the schools. Somebody else, who else wants to chime in here? What do you think about what's going on in the schools today? Trey, I think you wanted to say something earlier.
Sure. There's a couple things. I know, we went not off, but we engaged in more of the conversation for a little while. But I put a post up yesterday, and the more I think about it, it really touches me. But I'm not sure if you're familiar with the movie John Q, Denzel Washington, when he did a courageous thing, even though he did get in trouble for it. But when he stuck the hospital up to get his son some health care, because it was he didn't have the health care, right? But one of the quotes in the movie, he says, "My son is dying and I'm broke. If I don't qualify for Medicare, who the hell does?" Right? So I said yesterday, what if that movie was about education, right? And the actions in which he did. And I say that to say, I changed up the quote a little bit and said, my son can't read and I'm a taxpayer. If I don't qualify for tutoring, who the hell does? Right? And it's the same thing. And it's just
That is so interesting.
If you think about it from the standpoint of that movie and what he did and what people are doing to fight for their kids, depending on, income and different things. But I listened to the conversation tonight, and many people were very fortunate in this conversation based upon access and income to get specialized help. But a lot of people don't have that. There's a lot of people who are more on the John Q side of wanting to make a difference. And, I know myself, when I came to faith, I was in my John Q mindset of what can I do for my son? I got to do anything, and as a grown, and we've helped more people and done some cool initiatives here locally. But I do think overall, the schools are seeing the issue, but trying to figure out how to face it, right? Because that's two different things. I can see something, but if I face it, that means I have to deal with it and go forth and try to make a difference.
Bingo, Trey. Exactly. I think that schools are starting to recognize that there are issues, but putting it into practice and making sure that we're seeing those kids enough times is very hard. It requires manpower. It requires teacher knowledge, teacher training. It's
administration training.
Easier. Exactly. It's easier said than done. And Trey, you make another really good point. I work in the South Bronx. I love my students with all my heart. Most of them are getting tutoring. So that's amazing, because my principal made sure to allocate those funds that they get us, but they also get tutoring in the school, additional tutoring. Not all my students don't, a lot of them don't have the income or the resources. Many of those kids live in shelters or transitional homes. So, Jason is my client right now with his son, and that student, my little Zach, is lucky. His parents have those resources. They're making that time. And a lot of the parents, in the school where I work, of course they want help for their kids too. But it's not that easy. And I think that it does come back to administrators realizing we can't just say, oh, a kid is showing signs of dyslexia. It has to come into practice. We have to get those kids help. And very often seeing those kids just in tier 1 instruction in school or in small group once a week, that ain't going to cut it. Learning how to read takes time,
yes,
right, Trey?
It does. And I also think it's a mirror moment, like when you look in the mirror and you realize something is wrong. And I think people are realizing, and it's just like, whoa, how do we handle this challenge? Like, this is bad. We can't fake it, but how do we handle it? Because then we're going to realize that others did not get what they needed. Then it becomes the backlash. It's bigger than just the moment of helping the kids right away. I think it's such a big situation that it almost is like we need to even backlog and help kids 5 years of who graduated, and like it's such a major challenge.
Right.
So,
the genie is out of the bottle. You can't put that genie back in. And I think
that's
after
Faith
COVID
words during the pandemic. The Pandora's box.
it.
That was her words. It opened up and it made everybody realize, and I was one of them. So, but that's my feeling. I think schools are realizing it, but trying to figure out how to face it. And we have to figure out a little bit faster because kids only have 12 years to get this schooling.
Yeah, so that's right. And it is, COVID did open up Pandora's box. That was a big turning point. Danny, I know your kids are now grown, they're adults. So you're probably not keeping up with what's going on in the schools as much as the rest of the guys here if they have school-age children. But any thoughts about maybe from your memory, what you remember in terms of, what the schools were doing, what the state of schools were when they were in school?
My kids have been out 10 plus years, but I remember it was very minimal. That's why we had to seek outside help. I think they catered, like the school board was made up of parents where the kids were on Project Challenge, the smartest kids, and it really, they had the voice of the school district. That's my opinion. They seem to have the voice, and it was catered a lot to kids who were really who were smart, and there weren't any parents like us going to the school board and advocating and trying to get on the board and trying to push programs and more resources for our kids. So that's what I remember. So I don't know in the last 10 years if it's changed, but that's what I do remember.
Yeah, so I think all school districts tend to kind of push the star students, the ones who are excelling. I
don't know, Faith. I don't know if I agree with that.
You don't think that the board is made up?
I think from what I'm seeing in the field right now,
Judy, I don't want to interrupt, but this is 10 years ago. This is my.
Oh, no. Yeah. No, I think right now though, like where I am in New York City schools, I think it's more like what Trey was saying. Everybody knows that there's like a crisis in the school and that a lot of kids are struggling. And I think there's a lot of remediation going on for the kids that are struggling. And, everybody's hands are full. But I think that some of the kids that are actually the high performers on the screeners that are, not struggling are kind of also getting the short end of the stick because oh, they're okay. They'll be just fine. They're not at risk right now. So I think it's really a balancing act from what I see in the schools right now. And the danger with that is if we don't continue to, focus on the kids that are on level or above level, they can slip, right? Because it's not only about cracking the code, but it's really about being able to understand what you're reading. And the other thing is, I want to hear from Jason. I know that you and I have been working together now for 2 years, and your son, Zach, was the one that changed my whole existence. I was shifting into, structured literacy since 2017, but it was your son who is now one of the most special people in my life that said to me, Miss Judy, Miss Judy, Miss Judy, the school is telling me to look at the picture and not sound out the word. And I'm really, really confused. And that was 2 years ago. And now he's broken the code. So I would love to hear from you about the state of schools and what you're seeing in terms of the shift.
Yeah, there's a couple things there, and a lot's already been said. I think, for me, and just reflecting back on my time and what's changed between when I went to school, I graduated high school in 2000 to give you perspective. So we're talking late 80s, 90s school. That had at least a little bit of a breakup in the education. What I mean by that is you had reading and writing, and there was a lot of that went on, but you had other subjects too. They weren't interrelated. And since I've graduated and now my kids go to school, I'm seeing a lot of this interrelation of these subjects. And I get it. When you get to middle school to high school, it all does build on itself. But for myself personally, math was an outlet for me. It was a way to excel. And now I see it. I actually have 2 children on IEPs, and my third one is actually the one that excels. But for the ones that are on IEPs that have the support that need all these different resources, I mean, even when you have a basic math problem, my son's in 2nd grade, it's a written problem. It's not what's 2 + 4. It's Johnny has 2 apples and takes 4 more off the tree. How many apples are in Johnny's basket? You just had to read that entire paragraph, and you had to write a sentence answer and show your work in there. All great things to do, and I understand it, and I understand why, but you've now brought multiple subjects into one primary subject that's a building block. And I think a lot of what I've seen in the schools is this desire to push as fast as we can, as far as we can with the kids. This works. I mean, Danny said it right. It's, the top kids tend to be where the focus is. So of course, if you have a student who's excelling, they're going to do great at this, and they'll go even further faster. But it's not about the top kid. It's about everyone else, making sure they catch up, making sure that people have a little bit more time to unpack. We've forgotten this. I mean, one thing that Jude and I talk about, I don't know about your school districts, but for ours, they really just don't focus on handwriting. It's not important to them. It'll come. Eventually they'll pick it up. And I've had to take it on myself. I actually bought old handwriting books from when I was a child, use those with, my own kids, so they actually have legible handwriting. And it's just amazing how much of these basic building blocks that have been glossed over, that have been sort of pushed to the side and said, yeah, we're going to focus on this. Look at the end result. They're so much better in the end. One last bit, because I've probably been going on too much. We found the secret sauce in our school system. So we've got right now just about to finish 7th grade. Our oldest, we've got one that's in 5th grade, and then we've got one that's in 2nd grade. Well, our oldest, when she was going through, she struggled, and we did all sorts of things. We were not fortunate enough to find Judy. For her, it was too late. We did other programs that were expensive and time consuming. That they worked, but probably would have had more success otherwise. But we had this aha moment when she got to 5th grade. 5th grade was the last grade before middle school. And yeah, there was the curriculum, but the 5th grade teachers were all seasoned. They were all experienced, and they carved out time every single day to fill all the gaps. They went back to brute memorization for mathematics. They went back to spelling tests and writing tests and all these other things, so that when the kids got to middle school, they didn't have problems. And that wasn't part of the curriculum. That was just what the 5th grade teachers did, because they knew there was a problem. And it's just sad we don't have that discussion yet of, wait a minute, why do the 5th grade teachers have to pull something aside so when the kids get to middle school, they're actually capable? We've just taken too much out of the curriculum and changed it to get there.
So Jason, I could segue into everybody's children now, because you started that off right now. I'm going to just ask you quickly, Jason, when did you realize you had to start advocating for your children?
So I'm fortunate, as I said, for my background. I advocated extremely early on for all of my kids. And it was something where right at the get-go, is there a problem? Is there an issue? I was more worried. And you'll talk to everyone, they'll say these things are not hereditary. It doesn't get passed down from generation to generation. I didn't care. I had to ask, I had to find out if there was any issue, any hesitancy, any concern. Where is it? What's happening with our kids? I saw it happen with me successfully and felt every minute, every ounce of savings I have, if I can help fix these kind of problems, I saw the difference it makes when it happens early on. So it was, literally kindergarten, very early parts of kindergarten for each of our children, constant check-ins with the teacher. Where are we? What's happening? What's on grade? What's not on grade? Where are we supposed to be with this? And it's, even though we did that, our oldest is still struggling a little bit. She has some other pieces that she's going through, but she's making great progress and she's becoming a great student. And my little one, Zach, that we've been fortunate enough to work with Judy on, has definitely filled almost all the gaps at this point, because we've spent a really intense amount of time. But he's finishing second grade and we're having a great conversation about this. That's because that started not even in kindergarten, actually before kindergarten, with some of the supports we put in place.
Stephen, what about you? Clearly, you were diagnosed with dyslexia, so you knew, I'm sure, that you were going to be on top of this with your own children. Could you talk a little bit about your advocacy with your own children? Stephen, you're muted.
I was identified in third grade. However, that's about the last of it as far as my school career goes, that I really thought about dyslexia. I didn't think about it much later on in life. I heard all kinds of things about why I was dyslexic. I had a counselor one time tell me I was dyslexic because my dad was an alcoholic years before I was ever born. So I never understood that dyslexia is hereditary. It is passed down through generations. I'm dyslexic. What do we say? 1 in 5 of our population worldwide is dyslexic. Well, we're hitting 60% in my house. I've got 3 boys, 2 of which are dyslexic. My 2 oldest are dyslexic. I saw it in my oldest son from the very beginning. But he loved to sit and look at Diary of a Wimpy Kid. So he got all the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books growing up, and he would sit there and look at it and be sitting on his bed, and I would ask him, Asher, are you really reading those? Because I could see a lot of the same behaviors that I would do as a child, or I did as a child. I could see him doing the same things.
That's very interesting. So for you, it was the recognition of doing the same things that you used to do, and that made you realize you had to get on top of this.
Well, so my middle son was identified in third grade, but Asher, my oldest son, was not identified until 7th grade.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, all right,
and they were all straight A students. Asher, my oldest, was pre-AP honors classes, everything all the way up to 7th grade until he hit that wall. Aiden struggled from very beginning, and we knew. I was like, "This is dyslexia. I see it. I know exactly what he's dealing with and struggling with." So we got him tested in 3rd grade, and he went through remediation. He did take flight and MTA in our district. The one thing that I didn't say was, you asked what the state of schools are in. They're horrible. I'll be the one that will say it. They are horrible. And I'll back it up with numbers. Our state has 5.5 million kids. Earlier I said 1 in 5 people are dyslexic. So out of 5.5 million kids, how many kids should be identified in Texas? Anybody good with math? We got some accountants here. How many kids should we have? Anybody?
1.1 million should be dyslexic out of that.
Okay, so when I first started my advocacy, Texas had a whopping 170,000 kids that were identified as dyslexic. My district of 57,000 kids, 72 campuses, had a whopping 325 kids identified as being dyslexic.
But
So-
Stephen, I just have to jump in. Don't you think that number could be significantly reduced if we had the right instruction in tier 1? I'm
So-
not saying
so,
that
yeah.
there aren't more kids than what you're saying who have been identified, but a lot of that starts with kindergarten and getting it right in
I
tier
would
1.
love for people to use the same techniques that we're using for remediation in K1 and 2. Would we have less struggles? Absolutely. But I'll take it back to when we look at 50% of the Texas inmates have dyslexia, but we only have, at that point, we only had 1.7 or 1.4 percent of our students having dyslexia. I told our school district, so either A, you get dyslexia once you get to prison, or B, you're not looking. And we know Texas is the first state that got put on academic, what is it called? They were probation. They had to go back, and this was the first state that got found guilty of denying kids with dyslexia services and or testing identification. So when I see that, and I understand that Texas isn't special, it's all over the country. I mean, even speaking with the commissioner of the education in New York at the Made by Dyslexia event. I mean, New York has just as many problems as the rest of us.
You bet.
And last thing I'll say about this real quick, when was dyslexia first written about? Do you know? Anybody know?
When it was first written about?
Yeah, when we first identified it, first wrote about it, was 1881. That's the first time dyslexia, the words dyslexia was written about. First it was word blindness, then it's called dyslexia. So we've known about dyslexia for a long time. I was identified in 83, and it wasn't until early 2000s that kids actually started getting real help. So a lot of this really falls on the shoulders of our education system, both K-12 and our higher education colleges, for not preparing our teachers correctly to come in and do their jobs.
100%. 100%. Tre, what about you as far as advocating for Ernesto? When was it that turning point for you?
For me, it was second. For my son, it was second grade during the pandemic. You know, it was just eye-opening that he was struggling the way he was. You know, just sight words and different things was, if he could get those right. I mean, I really believed at that time he could not read. But at the same time, you know, I think, as you mentioned, with this, the right instruction, the right training, you know, it makes a world of a difference for teachers as well as for the children. You know, I do think outcomes right now for children are bad in schools. You know, when it comes to literacy, right? If you look at the numbers, they do look bad, but I think it goes back to a few things that we mentioned earlier. Do we have universal screenings, you know, in kindergarten right away, right? We all know that certain children are coming to school with different tool sets, and the amount of words that are spoken in the home, so that challenges things immediately when they get to the school. Additionally, with teachers not having trained. So I think it's a lot of different issues compiled that are causing the challenges that we have. And I think people are trying to address them. Whether people feel it's fast enough or not, that's you know, an opinion. you know, and I can't say it is. I know some kids don't have the support, as I mentioned earlier about John Q. But I think we have to really find out what is the biggest need to fix these things, right? There are challenges when teachers have to teach for the test, right? Some kids won't get the basic foundational things, right? And so I think it's a bigger mantra than just dyslexia, literacy challenges, historical, right? If we look at literacy laws from years ago, how that affected families, especially African American, when it was illegal for them to read. I guess a lot of layers to this. So I think as we're breaking this down and addressing it head on, is opening up people's eyes about so much history, as Steven said, right? Like there's so many layers that generational challenges prolonged all this time because of these issues that were never addressed. And I think that's the biggest thing that I feel that we're all saying is we need to address them so the generation challenges will slow down and eventually stop because they're being addressed, you know. And how do we do that? And it's hitting it head on with the right services, training, you know, just being honest about what's needed for kids.
And I
Trey,
know,
would you agree, Trey?
yeah,
Sorry,
sorry.
I was just going to say, would you agree that you have dyslexia and you have dysteachia, and the end result
100%.
is the end result is the same?
But I think what I do think is that it's very hard to convince a teacher who went to school, whether it was a top program and, you know, these different things, that they weren't taught the best skill to help a child. You know, I think that's very hard, especially because we judge these schools by names, right? I went to, you know, I didn't, but just saying I went to an Ivy League, and, you know, I went to, let's say, University of Texas, you know, and just being honest, I know how big that is down there. And if you're taught that you weren't taught football the right way coming out of the University of Texas, people think you're crazy, right? So I think it's the same thing in education. Some of the schools that we go to, you know, right away, no matter what, we actually put blinders on ourselves because I went to Penn, and this is what we were taught at Penn, and Penn's the top school in the country to work with kids with, you know, reading issues, but then they weren't taught the science of reading. They weren't taught phonics. They weren't taught phonemic awareness. So I do believe that this dysteachia, as you said, and dyslexia do have the same results, but I think there are solutions to counter all of that if we decide to work on it. Yes, we can talk about the issues because they are valid, as you mentioned, but it's really finding solutions to make a difference if we really want to make a difference.
So Faith and Judy, the question of both of y'all. So off the dysteachia and the dyslexia, since y'all both work with kids who have learning disabilities, wouldn't you agree that if you taught a non-dyslexic non-reader and a dyslexic non-reader with the same type of materials that you're teaching a dyslexic, both of them would grow and both of them would flourish?
100%.
Yeah.
So it's actually interesting you said that, Stephen.
Let me just finish. But the child with dyslexia, it might take longer. It might be a little bit more intensity. But yes, you would do it the same way, and you would hope to get a good result. I just want to make sure I get to every dad before we go any further, because I want to make sure I hear from everybody.
I just have one quick point on what Steven said. So when we had COVID, you know, we tried to figure out how to fill the gap, and we actually we used the Linda Mood Bell program with my eldest and my middle child, which is a program that's formatted somewhat around helping with dyslexia. My middle child, no issues. And to your point, this was that case study. Was good for my older child, but my middle one just catapulted ahead from that learning style. So we saw that real world that you take the same thing you use with someone who has dyslexia and use it for someone who doesn't. It still is tremendously successful. So sorry, didn't want to go off the track, but we lived that firsthand, and you're 100% right.
I'm glad you said that.
Danny,
Danny,
can I say?
Wait. I just want to. Let me just get to a couple more, and then we'll wrap up. So, Danny, tell us about with your children. Like I said, you have 3 children, twins, and then another child. So, what was the turning point for you?
Well, all my kids were born prematurely. My first came in about a month early, and I think that started the whole whole issues with being premature, being a neonatal unit, and we kind of really started suspecting something when in pre-K. And matter of fact, out of all the teachers they had, the pre-K teacher was more aware of their issues than any other teacher through high school. So we started getting services in pre-K. So that's basically where it started.
Was the pre-K teacher an older woman?
Yes. Yes, she was definitely was there for many years. I think her name was Terry. She was fantastic, and she pulled us aside and said, "This is what I see. We can apply to the school district for." At that time, it was fine motor skills and some other things, and so we said, "Okay, that's great." And that's when me and my wife said, "You know, we got to stay on top of this." Due to the history of their birth and my history, and that's basically where it started. Yes, she was an elderly woman who old school, and she recognized it right away. Very appreciative of her coming to us and being straightforward with us.
It's so interesting, that old school mentality, right? When she probably was taught phonics herself, I'm assuming, and she was able to recognize these things. John, what about you? What was your turning point when you started to get involved?
So, like I mentioned, I was one of those kids who I don't recall being taught how to read. And so I did not really have a foundational background to be able to say where it was. But my oldest was diagnosed very early with a gross motor delay. There was generalized, and this is pre-K, generalized knowledge that there was an issue there, but wasn't sure it was dyslexia in his case. Now diagnosed dyslexia, dysgraphia, and the motor delay. Yeah, COVID was kind of the oh my god moment, because that was his late second grade. 2020 was his 19 to 20 school year was second grade. 20 to 21 was third for him, and he would be doing, and spelling was always hard. And in second grade, his teacher would feed me the spelling words, and we would just drill them, just memorization. But he would write characters on the page that they weren't Roman characters. I mean, that might have been an omega. That might be Cyrillic. I'm not sure. But it did not look like the letters that we know how to form. So I will save the rants on half covered that. But it's at that point it was words their way. It was 3Qing. It was things that just fundamentally were not structurally going to help a kid with dyslexia, who now that he's diagnosed now, but at that time somehow he passed or made it through the screener by the skin of his teeth. Sheer luck, don't know. We actually unenrolled him from the district for most of his third grade year. We used Barton for a lot of that year just to catch him up to speed. And just kind of said the same thing. My youngest, who was kindergarten year that year, kindergarten Zoom school was useless, but that's beside the point. He was kind of latching on to those. And he's a great reader now. It's by introducing, truly explicit systemic instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics and fluency. These are all the things that my wife, who is a certified reading specialist in the state of Illinois, was never taught in college. In 6 years, she'll probably correct me on this, but 6 years of postgrad. And now my 12-year-old, teenager, God bless, is a voracious reader, loves to read. It's the best problem a parent can have, because found out that 2 nights ago he was under the blanket with a flashlight reading his book until like 1:30 in the morning.
That's what you would hope, right?
Such an aha, like thank God that he figured that one out. But my youngest also has an IEP, and his is general anxiety, and he has issues with a lot of what I had with shutting down when tasks get hard. But a lot of that anxiety came from the pandemic. A lot of that came from wherever we are in this particular issue, not trying to make this political, but he sees a mask and he panics because he doesn't want to have to be locked down again. He doesn't want to have to be told where he is and what to do, and he still struggles. We actually are moving him from the lovely balanced literacy programs that are in his home district that I pay $18,000 a year in property taxes to stay in. And we're going to a Montessori next year for him, which is, for his style, is probably going to do really well. But yeah, it absolutely galls me to pay that much in property taxes. I might have the bill here if we want the dramatic effect, but it galls me how much we're paying.
It costs a lot of money to go into a private school just to get the help that you need, that should be a given in all public schools. So to wrap up, I'd love to hear one piece of advice from each one of you about what you learned from your experience and what you would like to share with other parents, like that one tip, looking back on your own experiences with your own difficulties and what you've gone through with your children. What is it that you would tell parents right now that could really help them? Who would like to start? John? Okay, go ahead, John.
Start early, start often, and don't trust the school to find it for you. Fundamentally, I can't say I have such an ingrained and inherent, I don't know why, my wife gives me grief about it all the time, trust for the public school system, because it's one of our founding fathers' key elements. There must be a foundational public school system to further educate the entirety of the population. Every child has the right to learn to read. Period. Full stop. And the school is not going to.
Hey, they want to pull out. John, I'm pulling out a cheers button. We haven't had any guests on this episode.
We could cheer for all of them at the end, because
I think he deserves a special cheer right now, Faith.
And that's that. And as much as you can, get involved. Find ways, even if you don't have an educational background, if you don't work in the school, you can find a way to get involved in this, because there's nothing more important. I'll end my bit here with the Frederick Douglass quote everyone knows: once you learn to read, you will be forever free.
Jason, what about you?
Absolutely agree. I think it makes a lot of sense. And honestly, to build on what John said, it's that other famous quote, trust but verify. There's a lot that comes from the school, but there's a lot of other stuff that comes out there too. And I think just the journey we went on with our kids, just because you're giving them support, it still may not be the right support or may not be the right solution. I can tell you about the amount of time and money we've wasted doing this, that, or the other. If it's not working, it's not working. Find something that does. And, constantly asking. I remember at one point we went to a therapist for our daughter that was having learning issues. And, trust me, after 6 sessions, we'll have a catch up. We'll find out what it was. Biggest waste of time and money we ever had. Fired him on the spot. It was, now don't get me wrong, there's perfectly good therapists and all those other pieces. But if you're not getting the answers you need, you're not getting the solutions, you're not seeing the traction, you're not seeing it take place. When you find the right solution set, you've identified the problem, the right scaffolding and supports to go around this, things start to turn, and you notice that pretty early on. So don't sit in the same thing. I mean, the amount of tutors we did because we thought it was just extra tutoring to solve the problem, it's not going to work. You move on, find the right solution, and it's probably not the first or second thing you do. It's going to be further down that road, and the faster you can go through that, and the faster you can say, well, is this working? Is this really worth it? And if the answer is no, it's okay. Let's move on to the next thing we can do. Let's see what else is out there. Let's reach out. I mean, we've got Faith, Judy, Stevens here too. Lots of great resources, even online, that you can find. That maybe that's where the solution is. Maybe it's not in your neighborhood, but keep looking. That it's there, but it just may not be the first, second, or third thing that you find.
A lot of people waste money on franchises, and the franchises have teachers who are not necessarily trained. So just getting extra help is not always the answer. Danny, what about you?
The last two speakers have said a lot. Be an advocate. If something's wrong, step up. Technology wasn't there when my kids were there. There was no internet. There was nothing. So it was tough to, nobody really talked about it. So it was tough to get information. Faith, I forgot how we were turned on to you. I
think your wife reached out to me. She was
Probably.
the one who did at the beginning, but you were the one who was bringing them to tutoring. And
Absolutely.
I probably spoke to you more than Jill.
Well, she worked a lot of hours.
She was working a lot of hours, but I just want to let people know that the dads could be involved and
Absolutely.
are certainly an important piece to this.
And I also
And I
want
like what you said before about not pulling the kids out of gym or
Right.
things that they enjoy. That's something
And-
that parents should talk up about.
correct. And I also stressed a lot, my wife and I, that, to our kids that, we can't compare ourselves to the other kids in the district. You guys, you're working hard. You're going to get through your issues. You're going to get a job. You're going to do great in life. And that's what we kept on pounding in their heads. There's a college for you somewhere. We'll figure it out. Don't worry about it. Everybody, if we go into every house in my neighborhood, somebody's got issues going on. So, we're not the only ones dealing with problems. There's other problems too. So, thank God that they all came out. They all are doing really well. They went to good colleges. They're happy. So, so far, so good.
Trey?
I just, for me personally, and I'm big on just like sort of like Stephen calls it, like what it is. And as a Black male educator, right, and as a Black man, the word dyslexia is really unheard of often in the Black community. We can even see by the conversation tonight, right? Like this is majority a white conversation, around education, which is needed for all children. So I just hope that more people in my community get familiar with the word dyslexia, get familiar with the science of reading, and fighting for when your kids struggle, right? Because when we hear dyslexia in my community, it's almost like something's wrong with you, right? And that, I don't know how often you all come in contact with, just being honest, African Americans, but just run that by them. Like, do you know anybody in your family with dyslexia? Do you ever talk about it? And you'd be surprised how many people would be like, no, I've never heard of that. But they know their child or family member struggled in school, couldn't read, but they never got the diagnosis, nor did they really face the fact that they needed the help. So I just hope that more people within all communities, but in particular mine, learn how to, address these issues with dyslexia, illiteracy, and such, and get comfortable with the discussion. And like I said earlier, the solutions are there, the problems are happening, but it's about finding that locking key to make a difference.
You and I have spoken about this, Trey, that often in the African American community, it becomes a behavior problem rather than an academic problem as far as the labeling goes, that more kids who are Black or Latino, they definitely get labeled with more of, the behavior problem label.
Emotional support.
Recognizing that there is a reading problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't address it. And that's why I said, like, a lot of people had support from day one, right? And I don't know everybody's educational attainment on this call, but I know besides Danny, even though his career attainment is beyond, I've been listening the whole time, but as far as having degrees, I think everyone here might even have degrees, right? Sometimes when you're not in that type of space, you don't even know how to ask for that help. So many layers to it, right? And these families don't even know that stuff. So, it's more and more like we just got to find the right locking key to help people and address it, and be fair and honest about what's happening, not just put a pacifier on the situation.
Stephen?
So Trey, I'm a dyslexic ADHD high school dropout. So there's my education. But I do have the letters DAD after my name, which is the most important credentials to have. And I'll say this, I want all fathers to understand how important it is to have you, as Faith said earlier, show up and be there and learn about what's going on with your kids. Understand if it is a reading disability or if it's just dyslexia, whatever, that you're going to be there and you're going to make sure you're going to hold everybody accountable. When we end our 504 meetings, or if I'm going and being an advocate for other families, I end the meeting with this statement. I want you to hold me responsible as a parent, me and my wife. I want you to hold my kids responsible as students, because I'm going to hold each and every one of y'all responsible as educators and administrators to educate my child and every child in this district. One person,
Badass.
I want you to understand, one person can make a difference. One person, one parent can make a difference. I told you our school district had 57,000 kids and only 325 kids that were identified. We had a perfect storm going on. We had an incoming new superintendent. However, when you have strong advocates that are pushing, we went from 325 to over 3,000 identified dyslexics in less than a year. They went from only providing dyslexia therapy through paraprofessionals to having 115 or so certified academic language therapists across the district. They had one and or more at every campus in the district. And if we want to say that it's because they had more money, our district is an entire Title I district. In fact, most districts in Texas are Title I. Very few are not. So make sure that you understand what the laws are, what your responsibilities are as a parent, what the school's responsibility is as educators, and hold everybody accountable that's sitting there at the IEP or the 504 meeting.
Judy, last thought?
Well, I want to thank all you dads. I think you are all courageous men. Sometimes my coping mechanism, strangely enough, is to hide under a blanket when I'm stressed out and pretend that there's nothing wrong. And each of you men are coping by taking action. And I think that's so inspirational and so healthy for me to hear, because avoidance doesn't solve problems, and you guys are in it for yourselves and for your kids and for your families. So thank you, thank you, thank you for being here today. Thank you for joining us on the Literacy View. Anyway, everybody, follow us on theliteracyview.com. Follow us on Twitter at Faith Borkowski. Follow me at FaithandJudy. Join our YouTube channel. Join our Facebook group, Real Teachers Letting Loose, the Literacy View. We're growing every single day, and we're hoping to change lives one view at a time. Thank you, dads. You are inspirational. We want to hear more from you. We hear a lot from dyslexia moms, from women, but it's been a complete honor and pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Stephen, for talking about that stigma with words like disability and, kind of like, reframing my thoughts on it a little bit. For a while I was like, okay, it's a disability. That means there's something wrong, and that's so negative. But, all of you have spoken about the acknowledgement of saying, hey, there's something that's not going well right now. And it's okay to acknowledge that and want to make the situation better. All kids, all humans have a right to be literate. So I stand proud of all of you, and thank you for joining us. Till
I think we should give a cheers now. Ready, Judy? Here we go. Thank you, everybody. It was really a pleasure. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, and happy Father's Day to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet everybody.